A bull moose can weigh over 600 kilograms. That is heavier than most riding horses on Earth. A moose can also run close to 56 kilometers an hour in short bursts. That is fast enough to outrun a wolf. Its legs are long enough to wade through deep snow that would stop a horse cold. Its hooves are built for exactly the terrain that gave Swedish cavalry the most trouble for centuries. So on paper, the moose looks like the ideal Scandinavian war animal. Bigger than a horse, comparable in top speed, built for snow, forest, and freezing cold. And yet Swedish cavalry regiments rode horses that had to be shipped in from Poland and Denmark at enormous cost. For generations, a story has circulated that King Charles XI of Sweden actually tried to fix this. That in the late 1600s, he ordered an experiment to replace cavalry horses with moose. The idea was simple on the surface. Stop importing expensive foreign horses. Use the animal that was already standing in Swedish forests, free of charge, perfectly adapted to Swedish winters. It is one of the most repeated stories in internet history lists. But historians who have gone looking for the original paperwork have found something uncomfortable. The primary documentation is thin, inconsistent, and in some cases untraceable. Some accounts describe formal trials before the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. Others treat the whole episode as an exaggerated legend that grew out of one very real and very different fact. Sweden did use moose in the 17th century, just not as cavalry. Moose were harnessed to pull the sleighs of royal couriers, and they were extremely good at it. One documented account describes a courier moose covering something like 370 kilometers in a single day. That is a genuinely staggering distance for any animal pulling a sled through snow. So somewhere between a real working sled animal and a legendary battlefield mount, the story of moose cavalry took shape. And whether or not Charles XI personally signed an order for it, the deeper question the legend points to is completely real. If moose are strong enough, fast enough, and suited to the climate, why did no army in history ever actually build a standing moose cavalry? Not in Sweden, not in Russia, where the same idea was tried again centuries later, under a very different government. The answer has almost nothing to do with strength. It is hiding somewhere else entirely. Part of it is buried in the moose's nervous system. Part of it shows up only once a year during a few violent weeks in early autumn. Part of it is a stomach that simply cannot be fed the way a horse's stomach can be fed. And part of it is a problem that 1,000 years of horse breeding had already solved before Sweden ever needed cavalry at all. To understand why the horse won this contest before it even really started, you have to go back to how each animal evolved to survive. Horses evolved on open plains in large herds, surrounded by predators with almost nowhere to hide. Survival for a wild horse depended on two things working together: running fast when threatened and staying close to the group while doing it. A horse that panicked and bolted alone was a horse that got picked off, so evolution favored horses that fled as a coordinated unit, following a lead animal, reading the body language of the herd around them. That instinct to follow a leader is essentially a pre-installed piece of software for domestication. A rider does not need to invent trust from nothing. A rider only needs to convince the horse that the human is now the leader the horse would already be following anyway. Moose evolved under completely different pressure. They are forest and wetland animals, not herd animals of the open plain. A moose spends most of its life alone, or at most with a single calf. There is no herd to hide inside, no group of bodies to blend into, no leader whose direction to trust. When a predator threatens a solitary animal with no herd to disappear into, evolution tends to favor one of two responses: overwhelming aggression or an immediate, explosive, unpredictable escape. Moose evolved with both options loaded and ready, switching between them in a fraction of a second. That is a superb survival strategy against wolves and bears. It is a nightmare strategy for a soldier trying to sit on top of the animal during a cavalry charge. A horse under stress tends to run. A moose under stress can just as easily turn and attack whatever startled it, using its front hooves like sledgehammers. Multiple accounts of attempted moose domestication describe exactly this pattern. Handlers who could work with a calm, familiar moose for months, only to be charged, kicked, or gored the moment something unexpected happened. That alone would make moose difficult mounts. But there is a second layer to this problem, and it only shows up once a year. Male moose go through an annual rut, a period of intense hormonal aggression tied to mating season. During the rut, bulls that were manageable for the rest of the year can become genuinely dangerous, attacking vehicles, buildings, and people with little apparent provocation. Wildlife agencies in regions with wild moose populations issue seasonal warnings for exactly this reason. Now imagine trying to build a disciplined cavalry regiment around an animal that becomes unpredictably violent for several weeks every autumn, which happens to be prime campaign season across much of northern Europe. A horse has nothing biologically equivalent to this. Stallions can be aggressive, but centuries of selective breeding, and more practically, castration into geldings, solved that problem for cavalry work a very long time ago. So, layer 1 is the nervous system, layer 2 is the rut, layer 3 is even less glamorous, and it might be the most decisive of them all. It is what a moose actually eats. Horses are grazers. Their digestive systems evolved to process large volumes of grasses and, critically, stored feed like hay and grain. That single fact made horses compatible with agriculture in a way that mattered enormously. You can grow a field of oats, cut and dry a field of hay, and stockpile it for winter, and a horse's body knows exactly what to do with it. An army on campaign could carry feed or forage from farmland along its route. Moose are browsers, not grazers. Their natural diet is made up of twigs, leaves, aquatic plants, bark, and the tender shoots of young trees, not the fibrous, stemmy grasses that dominate hay. Research comparing the digestive efficiency of browsers and grazers has found that moose rumen microbiota are specifically adapted to that browse-based diet in ways that do not translate cleanly onto stored, dried, grass-based feed. In practical terms, that means you cannot simply stockpile a moose's rations the way you stockpile a horse's rations. A moose confined to eating only hay, the way a stabled horse does, tends to sicken rather than thrive. Feeding a working moose means constant access to fresh forage in specific seasonal quantities, which is logistically almost impossible to scale to the size of a military regiment. One study tracking free-ranging female moose even found that their food intake dropped by close to 40% over the course of a single summer, as rising temperatures and changing forage quality made it harder for them to eat enough. Which leads directly into the fourth problem, and this one is about temperature, not food. Moose are extraordinarily well insulated. Their coat and their sheer body mass are built to conserve heat through brutal northern winters. That is a tremendous advantage for surviving minus 30-degree nights in a boreal forest. It becomes a liability the moment the animal has to do sustained physical work in anything resembling warm conditions. A horse pushed hard on a summer campaign sweats and dissipates heat relatively efficiently. A moose pushed hard in the same conditions has comparatively poor options for shedding that heat, and overheats far more easily during prolonged exertion. That is part of why moose are so often seen standing in lakes and ponds during warmer months, deliberately cooling themselves down. A cavalry animal that overheats and needs to submerge itself in water every few hours is not a cavalry animal at all. So now we have 4 separate biological obstacles stacked on top of each other. An unpredictable, aggression-prone nervous system built for solitary survival rather than group cooperation. A seasonal hormonal window of genuine danger during the exact season armies wanted to campaign in. A specialized digestive system that resists the stockpiled feed logistics an army depends on. And an insulation system that turns sustained physical work in anything but cold weather into an overheating risk. Any one of these might have been solvable with enough selective breeding, given enough time. And this is where the story becomes less about biology and more about arithmetic. Horses had already been under human selection pressure for thousands of years before Sweden needed cavalry. Generation after generation, humans had already been quietly filtering out the flightiest, most aggressive, most difficult individuals, and breeding forward the calmer, more trainable ones. By the time gunpowder-era Europe needed cavalry, that filtering process had already been running for well over 100 generations. Moose domestication, by contrast, would have to start from zero, and moose reproduce slowly. A cow moose typically produces one calf, occasionally twins, after a gestation of roughly 8 months, and reaches breeding maturity only after a couple of years. Compare that to species that were successfully domesticated for meat or labor, which tend to reproduce faster and mature younger, giving breeders far more generations and far more chances to select for calmer temperaments in the same span of time. Even under ideal conditions, breeding a genuinely docile, battlefield-ready moose lineage from wild stock would likely take many human generations longer than most kingdoms had the patience, funding, or political stability to sustain. Sweden in the late 1600s was fighting the Scanian War against Denmark and dealing with the financial strain of maintaining a standing army. That is not exactly a stable multi-generational research environment for a decades-long animal breeding program with no guaranteed payoff. So even setting aside the disputed question of whether Charles XI's trial genuinely happened as described, the underlying reason a serious moose cavalry program was never going to succeed is not really a mystery at all. It is math, physiology, and timing working against each other simultaneously. None of this means humans stopped trying, though. The story does not end in the 17th century. It resurfaces in the Soviet Union, roughly 250 years later, under completely different political motivations. In the 1930s, and again under Nikita Khrushchev after the Second World War, Soviet agricultural planners revived the idea of domesticating moose, this time less as cavalry and more as a practical farm and forestry animal, suited to terrain where horses and tractors struggled. Several moose farms were established across the Soviet Union. Most of them eventually closed, defeated by many of the exact same problems that had frustrated Swedish attempts centuries earlier. Unpredictable temperament, the difficulty of feeding large numbers of browsing animals at scale, and the sheer slowness of building a genuinely tame breeding population. But one of those farms did not close. The Kostroma Moose Farm in Russia has continued operating for decades, and it offers the clearest real-world data available on just how far moose domestication can actually go. Researchers there have successfully hand-raised orphaned or captive-born calves from birth, imprinting them on human handlers early enough to produce genuinely calm, cooperative individual animals. Some of those animals can be milked, ridden by a single familiar handler, and even used in limited forestry work. Moose milk, in fact, has reportedly found a niche use in Russian folk and alternative medicine, particularly related to digestive ailments. That is a real, functioning, if small-scale achievement. But look closely at the conditions that made it possible, because they reveal exactly why this could never scale into an army. It requires imprinting each individual calf on a specific, consistent human handler from birth. It works with one animal and one bonded person at a time, not a regiment of interchangeable mounts that any soldier could be assigned to. It has never produced a stable, self-perpetuating, domesticated bloodline, the way horses, cattle, and dogs eventually did, where tameness itself becomes a heritable trait passed down automatically. Every single generation at Kostroma essentially has to be hand-tamed again from scratch, because true domestication, in the strict biological sense, has not yet taken hold. That is the difference between taming an individual and domesticating a species, and it is a difference that took horses thousands of years, and moose still have not crossed after nearly a century of dedicated modern effort. There is one more piece of this story that makes the moose's failure even more interesting, and it involves the moose's closest living relative in spirit, the reindeer. Reindeer were domesticated successfully by multiple cultures across the Arctic thousands of years ago. Same general climate, same snow, same forests, same northern hemisphere, and yet one large deer species became a working animal, herded by entire civilizations while the other never did. That comparison matters because it kills the easiest counter-argument a skeptical viewer might raise. Maybe it was not really about biology at all. Maybe humans just never tried hard enough, or never had the right incentive, or never had enough time. Reindeer proved that excuse wrong. Reindeer are herd animals, descended from ancestors that lived in large cooperative groups on open tundra, not solitary browsers hiding in dense forest. A reindeer's brain already came preloaded with the same herd-following instinct that made horses so trainable, the instinct to stay close to the group and take direction from whoever leads it. Reindeer also mature faster and reproduce a little more predictably in managed conditions than moose do, which meant herders could select for calmer, more cooperative animals across many generations in a realistic span of time. Put simply, reindeer had almost the entire package moose were missing: herd psychology, faster generational turnover, and a temperament that did not swing between explosive aggression and panicked flight the way a solitary forest animal's does. Arctic people spent thousands of years quietly running the exact same selective breeding experiment on reindeer that Sweden tried to compress into a single royal decree with moose. And it worked, because the raw biological material was already cooperative to begin with. That is the real answer to the obvious objection. It was never a lack of effort or imagination. It was that moose, unlike reindeer, unlike horses, unlike cattle, never had the underlying social wiring that domestication actually needs in order to take hold quickly. There is also a disease problem that rarely makes it into the popular retellings of this story, and it turns out to be one of the more serious obstacles Russian moose farms eventually ran into. Farmed and captive moose populations have shown particular vulnerability to certain livestock-associated diseases once animals are kept in higher density than their solitary, wide-ranging biology is adapted for. Wild moose spend their lives spread thinly across enormous territories, rarely coming into close, sustained contact with large numbers of other moose outside the rut. Concentrate them the way you would concentrate horses in a stable or cattle in a barn, and you create exactly the conditions many of their immune systems never evolved to handle. 19th and 20th century accounts of failed moose farming operations repeatedly mention disease outbreaks thinning captive herds, sometimes wiping out years of careful, patient hand-taming in a single season. That is a brutal setback for any breeding program, because domestication depends on keeping a stable population alive long enough, generation after generation, to actually select for better temperament. A disease outbreak does not just kill animals, it kills years of accumulated selection progress and forces the whole slow process to start again from a smaller, less cooperative base. There is also a stranger historical footnote worth including, because it shows just how seriously some rulers actually took the danger of a tamed moose falling into the wrong hands. In the 18th century, Catherine the Great of Russia is said to have restricted the domestication of moose, out of concern that political exiles banished to the vastness of Siberia might use tamed moose as a means of escape, since a moose can travel through terrain and snow depth that would stop a horse completely. Whether or not that specific motive is fully documented, the underlying logic tells you something important. Officials at the time clearly believed a domesticated moose, if it existed, would be an extraordinarily capable animal for exactly the terrain where horses failed. Nobody was doubting the moose's physical potential. The doubt was always about whether a moose's mind could ever be reliably brought under control at any meaningful scale. And there is an even older layer beneath all of this, a legend from the Mansi people of western Siberia, who, according to some accounts, rode moose into battle long before any European king considered it. Modern historians treat this claim the same way they treat the Charles XI story, as an evocative legend without solid archaeological or documentary confirmation. But legends like this tend to survive for a reason. They survive because the underlying idea feels plausible, because the animal really does look capable of it, and because somewhere in human memory, people kept independently arriving at the same tempting idea, generation after generation, culture after culture. A massive animal built for snow, strong enough to carry a rider standing right there in the forest. Every single time, biology quietly closed the door that intuition had left wide open. So, when you add it all up, the full picture becomes almost elegant in its consistency. A nervous system built for solitary defense rather than group cooperation. A hormonal season that turns a manageable animal briefly dangerous at the worst possible time of year for campaigning armies. A digestive system incompatible with stockpiled feed. An insulation system that fights against sustained work in anything but cold weather. A slow, reproductive cycle that starves any breeding program of the generations it needs. A vulnerability to disease the moment you concentrate the population the way domestication requires. And as the reindeer comparison shows, the deepest problem underneath all of it, a species that simply never evolved the herd-following psychology that made horses, cattle, dogs, and reindeer so willing to accept a human as their new leader.
Every one of those problems is individually survivable. Together, stacked on top of each other, across a species that reproduces slowly and reacts to stress with either violence or panic, they add up to something no royal decree, no Soviet 5-year plan, and no isolated success story out of a single research farm in Kostroma has ever fully overcome. The horse did not win this contest by being stronger. It won by already being cooperative thousands of years before anyone in Sweden or Russia needed it to be. Today, the moose remains one of Scandinavia's most recognizable wild symbols, appearing on road signs, tourism campaigns, and warning signs for drivers, rather than in a stable or a cavalry unit. It is treated as a creature to admire from a respectful distance, or occasionally hunted, but almost never as livestock, and certainly never as transportation. That single road sign, warning drivers to watch for a massive animal crossing the highway, is really a small monument to the same lesson the 17th century learned the hard way. Being bigger, stronger, and better adapted to the terrain was never enough. What mattered was which animal's inner wiring already matched the job humans needed done. And the moose, for all its raw power, was simply wired for a different world.